May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. So, when deciding what to talk about today, I had two major themes to pick between. One of them is Christian unity. And since this is the last day of the week of prayer for Christian unity, that's very appropriate. But the other one I don't think we talked about enough. So I'm going to talk about that one and leave it to the hymns and the readings to speak about Christian unity. Because all of the hymns today are on that focus. And the readings very much point towards the need for us to be one as Christ's body. And not to be too, picky about which part of the body is better. Because they are all needed. The other theme which runs through these readings, and is really, really important, is the theme of interpretation. They all speak about interpretation, and two of them directly. In our Old Testament reading from Nehemiah, it states that it was read with interpretation. And then when Jesus is sitting in the temple, he's given the scroll to read, the scroll of Isaiah, and he reads out this reading, and then he sits down, just like in Nehemiah, they sat down before the interpretation. And then he interprets the reading. Today, this has happened in your hearing. Now, interpretation as Christians is very, very important. And part of the reason that you have somebody in my position is because there's seen that importance of interpreting the readings that we have for the Sunday. And we train others within the church to interpret them as well. And there are two kind of major streams that I see about how we interpret the Bible. The first one, which is the one that I don't particularly like, is that we look at the Bible and we use it to define some key points. All our readings today have three key points about interpretation. One is joy, one is love, and one is the Messiah. So we can look at the readings and say, well, when we read these, how do they define joy? How do they define love? How do they define the Messiah or the Christ? Then there's the other way of looking at our readings, which is to say, we understand that God is calling us into joy, love, and the good news of Jesus Christ. So, given that, when we read the Bible, what does it say about everything else in the light of joy, love, and the good news of Jesus Christ? They lead to a very, very different way of looking at what it means to be Christian. When I was going to seminary, I had a supervisor at one of my placements who, when she was talking to me about learning to preach, said that one of the keys that she always keeps in mind for every sermon is that it's not over until you've gotten to the part where it's good news. We are called to preach the gospel. The gospel means good news. And so if by the time we get done talking about it, we haven't said anything that's good news, we're not preaching the gospel. We're preaching something else. That's about looking at the readings, looking at this book in the light of joy, love, and the good news of Jesus Christ. In our psalm today, there are a few words that I think are really important. The law of the Lord is perfect and revives the soul. So, when we read the rules in the Bible, we need to keep in mind that they are not to push anybody down or aside, but to lift up, to revive the soul. If we're using them in some other way, we are not living up to God's law. The testimony of the Lord is sure and gives wisdom to the innocent. We look for God's wisdom in places where we don't expect it. It's not necessarily going to come from the one who spent the most time studying. It's not going to come from the one who we say knows the Bible front and back. Those that I would call people of the book. And I don't use that as a good term. If what we're about is the book, instead of about Jesus Christ, then we're not following that call. By them also your servant is enlightened, and in keeping them there is great reward. Following God is not about living a miserable life. It's about ensuring that that joy and love is not just available to us, but to everyone. So this theme of interpretation that's spoken of in our readings today is so important. And the way we approach interpretation is just as important. If we think for one moment that what we read in the Bible will be clear and tell us exactly what we need to know about God, we've got everything backwards. Because while what's written in here contains all things necessary for our salvation, it's only the arrow that points us there. The true Word of God is Jesus Christ. Paul talks about this in his letters when he talks about, are you a disciple of Paul or a disciple of Apollos? No, you're a disciple of Jesus Christ. One of the really common things to get caught up in for Christians is interpreting the gospel in light of the epistles, of the letters. I think we need to do it the other way around. When we read the letters, we read them in light of the gospel. So always keeping in mind what Jesus calls us to do when we read them. So what does Jesus tell us about what the early church was doing and saying? Not what does the early church tell us about what Jesus was. And every time we open this book, we need to realize that it's already interpreted. We're not reading it in the original language, and anytime you translate, you interpret. We're not living in first century Judah. So just by reading it in our culture and our society, it's interpreted. That's not a bad thing. And in fact, that's a very good thing. That this book, written so long ago, can still inspire us to do good things in God's name. Means that it is truly inspired. It does have meaning. It is important. And it can be our guide. So please do interpret. All of us need to interpret what we hear. But I ask that you do it from that point. That we start with that acknowledgement that God is trying to bring us joy. That we are beloved. And that Jesus Christ is good news for all people, whether we agree with them or not. And then that prayer at the end of Psalm 19 that I use to start every sermon can have true meaning. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer.